Turn to the person next to you and say, "Are you okay?" Okay. Thanks for that, Justin. And Justin, in a beautiful way, honest, straightforward way, he just told us that for some blokes in our industry, it's a tough walk. And so the issue of mental health in construction and is suicide a workplace health and safety issue, it's a red-hot question, isn't it? And so to help us unpack that, we've got a red-hot panel. And I'm not going to introduce the panel, but I am going to introduce the moderator of the panel. And hopefully she's well known to you. Emma Alberici is a senior journalist with the ABC, has been a foreign correspondent, runs Lateline. The two things that really appealed to me about Emma: she was accused of verballing Tony Abbott. But she also gave Nicola Roxon a fair shake at an interview I saw as well. Emma's an astute journalist. She's a mum with 3 beautiful kids, and she's here to lead us through this difficult question. So can you please welcome to stage Emma Alberici.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks very much for having me. It's a topic I hadn't ever really thought about until I was asked to come and help out today. But I guess, you know, it's not only your industry, it's my industry, it's I would hesitate to say every industry in this country and beyond has to think about this issue, because one of the first things that popped into my head when I got asked to come and help out today was the people that I know who've taken their own lives. Excuse me. Can I have a show of hands of people in the room who've been touched by suicide? Yeah. It's a pretty extraordinary thing, isn't it? And when you think about the fact that it's the biggest killer of men under 25, it's a really stark reminder. Thank you very much. The statistics are pretty horrific. So suicide, is it a workplace health and safety issue? I've got a group of esteemed brains in the field to join me up here on the stage, and I'll welcome them now. John Crittle, he's here representing the Queensland Master Builders Association. He's the group's Director of Construction Policy. John's key area of expertise is in negotiating enterprise bargaining agreements and workplace reform. He's led state government reviews into workplace health and safety, and he's also been instrumental in developing policies for the construction industry generally in Queensland. Dave Noonan is the National Secretary of the Construction, Forestry, Mining and Energy Union, representing 100,000 construction workers across Australia. Dave's been with the CFMEU for 25 years, and before that he worked on construction sites all over the country. He's held a number of union elected positions over the years, taking up the role of National Secretary of the Construction and General Division in 2006. Dr. Leslie Van Schubrick is Queensland's first Mental Health Commissioner. Hers is also a relatively new position. She only took it up 7 months ago. And before taking up the position, Leslie was in Western Australia, where in 2010 she set up the Mental Health Commission there. And I'm advised that there's only one other in New South Wales. Of course, there's a national Mental Health Commission, but at the moment only 3 state versions. Cameron Dean is a partner with the legal practice McCullough Robertson. He heads up the firm's workplace health and safety team. He provides He provides specialist advice and representation to clients in both the general and mining sectors with regards to health and safety compliance issues and prosecutions. And our final panellist today is Dr. Peter Chen. He's the Professor of Management in the University of South Australia's Business School. Peter's also on the board of Mates in Construction in South Australia. He's previously been Professor of Psychology at Colorado State University, where he was also founding director of the Occupational Health Psychology Graduate Training Program. Now, questions were pre-submitted, and we'll start with a question from Andrew Ramsey, Workplace Health and Safety Coordinator at the CFMEU Queensland and Northern Territory branch.
Our industry is at best of times a very dangerous accident with high accident rates, and yet we hear that workers are much more likely to die from suicide than an accident at work. I'd like to ask John Criddle and Dave Noonan what that says about our industry.
So, John, if we start with you, I think if I'm correct, the statistic is you're 6 times more likely to suicide than die from a workplace accident in construction?
That's true. That is the right stat. And as Andrew, the employers are fundamentally intimidated and scared by mental health issues in general. They are flat out trying to work out preventing people getting injured at work than to get into the mental health aspects of their employees. So they're fundamentally intimidated by the whole topic. We all ask each other, are you okay? If an employer asks a worker, are you okay? And the guy says, oh look, actually I got diagnosed with clinical depression last week. Could you just imagine what the employer has to then confront? So at the moment we have a flight and fight, run away from this topic because we don't know how to handle it. We don't want to ask, are you okay? For fear of you saying, I'm not okay. So I think that it's conferences like this that are seeking to break down the barriers. The fact that you're asking it as a question, is suicide a health and safety issue at work? The fact that we're asking that question means that there are lots of people, including lots of my members, who would rather never know about how you're feeling as long as you come to work and do your job. And I think that part of the conferences like this is to raise that profile, understand that work is a lot more than just what people do on the job. And this is the challenge for our industry, it is a challenge for lots of industry, and bosses, I have to tell you, are a long way behind in trying to, because if you don't ask, then you never have to confront the answer. And we'll talk about it a bit more later on.
Dave, is that your experience?
Partly, Emma. I think a couple of things. First of all, I think it's really refreshing that John's frank enough to make that statement that employers don't know how to deal with this. And I think that that's a bit like individual workers. Individual workers could never know how to deal with these things. And an issue like suicide. That's why the industry requires a collective response to these big issues. I look around the room and I look at other people on the panel, and I don't have any academic qualifications around suicide or mental health issues. But like a lot of people in this room, I've had some bitter experience of it, both through workmates who took their own lives, and indeed my own nephew took his own life through suicide. Now, you can try and come up, and I could try and come up with a narrative that simply blames employers or says it's all about the industry. It is more complex than that. But when you have, I think 2.3 times, I mean statistics are, in my view, unreliable, but we know that there's a very high rate of suicide amongst construction workers. And I've heard people say, well, it's a high-risk industry, a lot of construction workers by nature are risk takers. I mean, the reality is there are all sorts of people in the construction industry, from people that ride Harley Davidsons to people who are evangelical Christians. It's a very wide scope of people. It's 1 million people in our industry.
So you can't ride a Harley if you're an evangelical Christian?
I don't think I think that may be a problem in Queensland, as I understand it. And of course, with the level of guilt by association which is being thrown around in some areas of politics and the media, you know, you wouldn't want to walk past someone riding one. But quite seriously, we can't deny that the unacceptable and tragic rates of suicide in our industry have a relationship to the industry. You know, the relationship, construction workers, this high level, there has to be a relationship to the workplace. And I think, you know, there's a range of things. There are still incredibly excessive working hours in the building and construction industry. We see cheap shots. The Daily Telegraph in Sydney ran one of these articles the other day, and you're going to see more of them saying how high-paid building and construction workers are. They said someone working on Barangaroo could earn $150,000 a year, and they could if they work every hour God sends, you know? And some of them will. But of course, behind that is a hell of a lot of overtime, a hell of a lot of stress, a hell of a lot of pressure, and a hell of a lot of a person, usually a bloke, who's not with their family. At the moment, our union in Western Australia is trying very hard, along with other construction unions, to renegotiate agreements for some of the large mining and resource projects. And you hear people who've never been near one of those projects talk about inflated wages on them. Very few of them know that the typical construction roster for FIFO workers in the Pilbara is 4 weeks on, 1 week off. And they travel home in the 7 days, a lot of them to the East Coast, some of them overseas now, within that 7 days. Imagine the impact that has on a family's life. So I turn back to the very welcome concession, I think, not concession, statement that John made at the beginning. We don't have individually the answers to these problems. That's why the union back in the 80s took the bull by the horns in terms of saying it was drugs and alcohol in the first place, where the building unions, the BWIU in particular, but all the building unions said we need to do something about drug and alcohol abuse across the industry. And not the zero tolerance moral panic solution that gets thrown around now, but actually to deal with it as a substantive issue. And out of that drug and alcohol initiatives grew other initiatives about workers and men's and mental health. And of course, I think Mates in Construction, the Incolink program, AusHelp are all linear descendants of that, of unions collectively, first of all, saying we've got to deal with this issue. Our safety responsibilities to our members don't just end in the workplace. We have to broaden our approach to these things, and the employers have come on board in a big way over all of those years, and I welcome that. I think it's terrific. And what it points to is that this reductionism that says you just isolate a workplace, isolate a company, it doesn't work in the construction industry. We are an intensely social industry that relies on lots of interaction between individuals and companies. We have to find solutions collectively.
Professor Chen, do you have any specific insights into what makes the construction sector that much more vulnerable than other industries?
I won't say I have an insight, but I do have some observation. I remember a couple of years ago when I was in the US, one day I was in the UA headquarters and talked to United Associates. They told me that they look at their retirement records, they found out several members died by suicide. So I started to dig out the data, and I talked to Center for Protect the Workers' Rights. Specifically is the institution doing construction research. When I raised those issues, I was often asked by the employers, by the unions, the first question is they're trying to find cause. They're trying to find a single cause they can pinpoint who is responsible for. I think that's probably is the most important barriers when we talk about the suicide prevention. Because when we started to think about this only one single cause, we immediately trying to pinpoint someone or some individual, some particular event responsible for. So typical question I was asked is, Are they taking alcohol? Are they taking substance? Are they taking drug? We all know those are the risk factors, but they are not, to me, they are not the real cause per se. Because if you think about people who decided to die by suicide, it's more like, try to imagine it's, let me use a metaphor. Say Colorado River, start with a tiny bit of creek, and the different creeks join together and become a smaller river. And the river get wider, to the point, need to find a way out. That's the end of the individual when they decided to die by suicide because they find no way out, and that's the only way. So if we start trying to find out the cause, the single cause, to say which creek is responsible for, which areas of that river is responsible for, I think that is the barriers when we think about suicide prevention, because we're trying to find a single reason. So we all know depression is an important risk factor, but the question is why people become depressed. I think that John and Dave actually raised a very important issue. That is, in the traditional definition of occupational safety and health, that definition has very, very clear-cut boundary. It happened at work as a traumatic event caused the injury and health. So you use this kind of definition to define suicide. It's very hard to fit into that definition because we always say, well, any kind of injury or illness has to have a single cause, caused by the workplace event. But Dave actually raised the important issue is the suicide causes is the nature of the industry, the nature of work. It's not about exposure for particular nail gun or particular dust. It's the nature of work. And workers, I work with the construction workers for more than 15 years in the US. I know they left home very early, particularly summertime, and they're trying to catch up more work, and they move farther away. I don't need to really describe what construction folks actually went through, because they do not have a lot of connection with their families. And someone can be my foreman. Tomorrow I can be another person's foreman by changing the job sites. So we don't really have a traditional so-called HR kind of human resources support or human support, a network, because we move around. And we don't, our friends probably will work farther away from us. So it's very different kind of system compared to the traditional industries. That is the nature of the work. And that culture itself could cause the major problem. So it's very hard to pinpoint a particular issue to say this is the event caused someone who decided to die by suicide.
Cameron Dean, as a lawyer, you're, I guess, in the blame game.
Thanks very little.
Is it easy to ascribe blame in the issue of suicide, the risk factors? I mean, we are about to talk about prevention programs and so on, but before we get to that...
Yeah. Look, I think it's very difficult dealing with an issue such as suicide. There can be obviously many contributing factors, and I don't think you can easily say it's one person's fault or another. Certainly in a legal context, often there are inquiries into reasons behind things. Certainly from an employer perspective and managing it as a work health and safety issue, where I see the issue really is around education. That is, that you can't manage what you don't understand. And there is, that broader obligation that employers and workers have to look after health and safety in the workplace. There needs to be understanding of what the factors are and how they impact upon workers, whether that's through things that have already been raised, so things like fatigue or time away from home that could contribute, drug and alcohol issues, or even other behaviours in the workplace, so workplace bullying. And I suppose that the complexity you have overlaying that is you've got possibly, and this is at the risk of generalisation, I suppose, but a workforce where there's a culture of hardness, I suppose, or not wanting to admit to weakness in that context. So I certainly think from a legal perspective, the issue comes from a health and safety viewpoint, comes back to people being educated about where these risks lie and what the appropriate steps are for managing them. As I say, you can't manage what you don't understand, and if you fail to manage it well, no doubt there'll be legal teams prepared to come forward and ascribe blame for that.
Now, Dr. Schubreck, I think first of all I'd like to know exactly what the Mental Health Commission does and what its objectives are.
Right, you and many others. The Mental Health Commission is a small government agency established about 9 months ago. It's similar to the other ones in Australia, and really our job is, we can't prevent suicide by ourselves. We can't stop mental illness by ourselves. We can't just keep pouring money down holes that attract people to large hospitals where they get really ill and hopefully they get better. The analogy I was drawing when I was watching the sea of men, the last time I saw such a sea of men, I think they had suits and ties because they were the most important bureaucrats in Western Australia, so they were all blokes with a couple of women. It's quite similar in many respects. But it's a bit like the things which we have to do is, if there's an issue, and we'll use suicide as the example, or mental health and drug alcohol problems, you need to find out what works, and if you can find out what works, you encourage other people to pick it up. You build bridges between people who are looking for a solution and people who can find a solution. You look for spaces where nothing's happening, and you look for spaces in, someone called it a helicopter view. If you look across Queensland and you take suicide prevention or mental health problems as an example, in what geographic locations, in what industries, amongst what groups of people are they not getting services? Is the suicide rate higher? Is the mental health rate higher? But we can't bring solutions because, like the suicide, I think the solution is a local solution. It's an industry solution. At the moment, it's a farmer solution. Anybody knew what to do about suicide in the farms at the moment, or the mental illness in the farms? Well, we know bringing rain would be good. We can't do that. But it's actually trying to help those people help themselves. And I think what some government agencies don't realise, sometimes their job is not actually to bring solutions, but to get bureaucratic red tape out of the way so other people can bring those solutions. So it's building bridges between what works, helping people connect with one another, getting stuff out of the way, and really nurturing the good ideas. I think in this space we don't actually need to do very much because you've got an organisation that is doing its best, and I'm not sure, apart from providing any extra space we can, any extra promotion, helping other people come into that space, we could do more than mates in construction are doing because they're people who understand your industry. So it's actually bringing that understanding. We don't expect to be on the front page of the paper every day, although some people think we should, because we're not the people you come to if you are an individual with a problem. We're the people behind the scenes trying to sew it together. So it's not easy. So trying to explain what you do in gobbledygook words, we are strategic planners who optimise the use of resources, and it goes on and on and on, and it's written somewhere. But it really is, it's an art to write those things, but I can't say them before morning tea. It really is bringing together people who can find out what works and helping that spread. And if governments knew what to do about suicide prevention, I'm sure they would have done it. And the solution is finding the people in the space, in the geographic space, if it's young kids, it's getting the kids together. I mean, I remember when my son was 18 and he was a pallbearer for his mate, watching those 18-year-old blokes come to grips with that. There's no mum, no dad, no parent could have helped them do that, and they needed to do it by themselves. You could give them space, but there wasn't much else we could do. They were lucky they had some trained people around them, but it's that sort of thing. I don't think you can expect governments to come in with solutions. And I guess it's the idea we're not being slack because I don't think it's humanly possible. It is a local solution. It's your industry. I think there is an issue. I've been around for a little while with my straight hair, and I do know men and women communicate differently, by and large, not always. I've observed this over many, many years, and I've seen my daughter move into spaces where my son and his friends have been over those last few years, and there is a difference. Not everywhere, but there is a difference, and the communication lines do tend to be open. I think it is good that the construction industry does have more women in it now, because whether the women like it or not, often guys in trouble will talk to a girl when they won't talk to a guy. It's my observation. It might not be I might not have researched it with, and I don't think you need a degree to do that, though. And I think those sorts of things do change some of that balance, because it is, as you've all said, asking someone if they're okay, and that doesn't always happen in the workplace, and it doesn't always happen when you're just blokes, unless you're two blokes fishing by the beach, and then you might, but not necessarily in the workplace.
Thanks, Leslie. Our next question is from Chris Doran, Professor of Health Economics, Hunter Medical Research Institute.
Thanks very much. My question is addressed to Leslie and Peter. From a big picture point of view, what flow-on effects do you think there would be for both the wider community and the construction industry if all 1 million construction workers were supported in a proactive workplace suicide awareness and skills training program that identified early problems and connected them to appropriate care?
Peter, perhaps we'll start with you.
Chris, could you repeat one more time or rephrase it in a different way?
I'm interested in looking at the flow-on effects for the industry and the community of initiating a program like Mates in Construction across the whole industry.
Okay. And I have opportunities studying Mates in Construction a bit, really through Jorgen. And it really gave me a different perspective. It's more than suicide prevention. That actually is the message I took away from Jorgen when we wrote a chapter together. It's really the way to change the community, to change the society. It's not necessarily just focusing on someone who attempts to suicide. Actually, it's trying to find a way to build a healthy workplace beforehand. So it's the structure of any construction job sites probably need to consider, and the family member need to consider, the society need to consider, is how we can actually connect people together, how we can actually make people feel that they are not burden of others, how we can actually make them feel that they can talk to each other. That's the community, that's the culture change, instead of just traditional suicide prevention programs I have been working with. I don't know whether I address...
Dr. Peter, could I just interrupt there a second? Sorry, with the greatest of respect, I don't agree with the doctor. We want Mates in Construction to be a suicide prevention program. We're clear about it, we put it in the literature, we talk about it, we tell people, we fought the people that said don't mention the word suicide, because if you mention suicide you'll get all the copycatters wanting to do it, you'll be giving them ideas. Bullshit, we're going to put it in, we are here to prevent suicide. That's the part I disagree with the doctor. The part I agree with the doctor is that we are the most disconnected, harsh, brutal relationship industry that I've ever met. We are isolated, it is brutal. And what Mates has done has connected people. There have been side effects, which are all the things the doctor did say. People are talking about other things, for sure. They are building relationships, for sure. But Mates in Construction, right up front, day one, is here to prevent suicides in the building industry if we can.
But what role does the employer play in that? Because does everybody in the industry necessarily know it exists? Do they know who is in the workplace to go to if they're feeling troubled? Is there always a point of contact?
The author of the program, Wally, in this room, said to the industry, you need to use the structures in the industry. And blokes will not go to doctors, they won't go to other people, they will come to workplace events, they will come to the structures in the jobs, there will be safety officers, there's safety committees, there are delegates, there are structures where people can talk on site. Bring the problem to the site and the site will be able to use the structures of the industry. Don't have us go outside and talk to some bastard because we're not going. And you give us a voucher and we're still not going. So it's not about the money. We're not going because we won't relate that way. So that's the challenge that's in front of us, and getting bosses to understand that humanising our sites, just a smidgen, just that tiny drop of human kindness on a job is going to go a long way. That's the challenge.
Is there something intrinsically wrong with the culture on building sites that doesn't promote this coming forward with your problems?
I'm of the old school that believes that the culture is driven by the economics and the framework and the economic framework that people are forced to work in. Construction workers have got big hearts. A lot of construction employers, a few I've met, have actually got big hearts too. No, I mean, a lot of them do care about these sort of issues. But the framework is one where you've got lots and lots of small companies. Most employers in the building and construction industry in Australia got less than 5 employees. Even on big jobs, there are multiple companies there. Construction workers, typically in Australia, are daily hired. Not everybody, but the vast majority, it's 1 day's notice either way. So it's a very, very itinerant workforce. That has got consequences for people's economic security, and I've already talked about the consequence of long hours. I'll go back again to the question of how we address this, and there is a lot in what John just said that I agree with. And I agree that we do need, and we have got, in a range of ways, collective union and employer and industry efforts. But I do want to say too, and you know, people can accuse me of being political, and they'd be right because I am, because politics has an impact on the lives of working people. We're about to see in the building and construction industry a Royal Commission. It's the 4th Royal Commission in 40 years. It's going to touch on a few other industries and it's going to try and kill Bill Shorten and all that sort of thing. But what we will see, and I predict it, and I've seen it before with Terence Cole and others, is an attack on what the Conservatives term as union slush funds, including redundancy funds, including superannuation funds, including in funds that generate income to assist workers and unions in conferences like this. The very organisations that are sponsoring this conference, that Royal Commission and this government's ideology is going to try and tear down. And it's a fact. And what will not be on trial at the Royal Commission is what are the best solutions for the real issues that beset the building industry. You're not going to hear Dyson Hayden from the High Court, who's a much smarter man than I'll ever be, look at why we've got more than double the suicide rate in the construction industry of other industries, and how collective efforts, including joint union and employer funds, not union funds, joint union and employer funds, have been employed to deal with issues like suicide prevention, like drugs and alcohol, and like collective agreements which deal with some of the excesses of working hours.
Can I draw you back?
So there's some politics in that.
And I think I have a strong suspicion we're going to talk a little bit about the Royal Commission in future questions. But if we can just contain this discussion to the issue of prevention programs and so on, how much responsibility, that's perhaps not phrased quite correctly, but as far as the union is concerned, what role do you play in terms of a structure that helps your workers get through difficult times and prevent them from taking these drastic steps?
Well, unions have struggled to grapple with this too, but I think, and John mentioned Wally Trahir, and Wally's here, his contribution in terms of mates in construction, and there are others out of union ranks who've taken the lead, and basically the union on its own, or an individual union official or an individual shop steward or worker, can't fix the problem.
But when you, in a practical sense, when you, I'm not obviously expert in how these things work, but when you go out to a site, when you've got a delegate there, or is this part of the discussion, the regular discussion that your leader on the site will engage with the people about?
Oh, very much so. I mean, you know, an organiser, and I organised for a long time, the first thing you'll do going to a construction site is look at the safety. That's the very first thing, because it hits you in the face.
And that's normally physical safety.
Physical safety, what's in front of you. But we have evolved, and there is an enormous amount of discussion within the union and in the union's interaction with its members and delegates about issues like mates in construction, and also with employers. And it's an area of a lot of common ground, as you've probably heard here today. We're never going to have 100% common ground with the MBA, but on this sort of issue with employers, there's a hell of a lot of common ground. But we would make sure, we would attempt to make sure that we've got the structures in place so that as far as you can on a construction site, people that are at risk are recognised and that options are given to them and paths are given to them so that when the streams are starting to run together, as my colleague spoke about before, we're actually in a position to try and have an option for that worker to do something other than fall into the darkest depression, into perhaps substance abuse, and also, you know, to take that road out of suicide. So delegates play a role in that, occupational health and safety representatives play a role in that, organisers and health and safety officers of unions play a role in that, in conjunction with employers. But in particular, there's been a hell of a lot of awareness raising done. I don't think we've got anywhere near the 1 million workers that you've talked about in the construction industry in your question. But we've trained thousands and thousands of workers around Australia in recognising the warning signs, some of the warning signs. We've got to get a lot better at it. But my important point, and I know I'm going to come back to the political question I raised before, are we going to go forward on this question? Are we going to get better at doing it, or are we going to go backwards? And if we take a reductionist view that splits the industry down, atomises the industry, and tries to intimidate industry participants from acting collectively, workers, unions, employers, then we're going to go backwards. And that is a real threat to the sort of progressive programs that Mates in Construction and others are running.
Can I just say two things since they asked me the question, not these blokes?
I was about to say the same thing.
Just very briefly, on the question of bullshit that John raised, I think I agree with him. This idea that you can't talk about suicide is something we need to get over. There's different things about reporting and there's a whole swag there, but if you don't talk about it, you pretend it didn't happen, then you don't see if someone's okay. You know, you don't, as one guy said to me, you don't come around with 6 stubbies and say, are you okay? You go away as though you might be contagious. So I think we do have to get over that in the workplace and everywhere else. But the other just point I wanted to make, look, I agree you should expand programs like this, but they're not the sort of programs you make compulsory training and will do your hour today on suicide prevention. You know, you just watch the eyes glaze over and it can be counterproductive. So yes, you do need to spread it, but I think you do need to spread it with a lot of wisdom from the people on the ground who know how to get those connections. Otherwise, you just wasting people's time and building up that like, oh, well, you know, we're going to get on that training today, and, you know, it was just a load of wank. Sorry. It was just a waste of time. So I think you have to be fairly careful about that. So, yes, spread it, but...
Leslie, can I ask you, you've been engaged in this particular matter for more than 3 years. Yeah. Have you seen a prevention program that demonstrates best practice? Can you give us an anecdote?
I think some of the stuff, and I suppose the space I've been is the space in schools, where they do actually, some of them work because you know that something has happened. You bring in some wise people and you can stop it spreading. So it's not the sort of the prevention of the specific suicide. Like if you knew where the suicides were going to happen, you can cut the suicides in that spot from 10 to 3. No. But you can, if you get the right trained people to go in, and that is actually talking about suicide. But then on the other hand, you see some of those, if you get the wrong conversations happening, it can make it worse. But generally they're very local solutions. Some good stuff happening in the northwest of Western Australia, as I understand, and that's using technology for young people so that they can talk amongst themselves on technology, because I know we went through that stage of don't talk about suicide. All the kids had mobile phones, they knew what was happening, and the adults pretended it didn't happen. So using technology so that they can actually seek out and get help in that way.
In what way exactly? What do you mean? Do you mean social media? Or?
Social media, absolutely.
How does that conversation start? Hashtag I'm in trouble, or what? How does that work?
Well, not being under 20. I haven't seen it actually in place, but that's my understanding now. They're actually really starting to get into there, and kids find hashtags. They have, and I think through some of the through their schools and through their headspaces and things like that, they are starting to reach out to one another. But it's all those microcosms, and I think that's the problem. If it works in a space, you often don't know about it. So it's not a solution that we can. It's not one you can pick up from here and put over there, I guess is what I'm saying. But I think the stuff that does work is, are you okay? Just that stops the prevention. And responding to people if they have been into hospital. I think they've shown if you've been to hospital for self-harm, you are less likely to come back for self-harm in the next 12 months if someone follows you up and says, are you okay? Connects you. So it does show it does work.
Cameron Dean, there have been some very high-profile cases in recent times that have explored these issues, and judgments from the court that perhaps inform the way employers, unions and co-workers should behave to prevent this ultimate outcome. And what I'm reminded of by what Leslie was just talking about there with teachers and schools was the Gavin Wood case. Yep. Are there lessons to be learnt from that case? He was an assistant principal, I think, deputy principal at a school. Are there lessons from that case that can translate to the construction industry?
Absolutely. I think one of the things and the interesting aspect of how the legal framework sits over this, of course, is that under the work health and safety legislation, your obligation is to manage risks so far as reasonably practicable. And when you look at what reasonably practicable means, that includes what you knew or ought to have known. And so there's a legal prerogative to have this understanding of these types of issues and how they might affect someone in the workplace. Now, the Gavin Woods inquest didn't gain a heck of a lot of press, I suspect, maybe because it was handed down in the middle of December, just gone. And that was an instance where Mr Woods had personal issues as well as workplace issues. There weren't any findings out of that inquest in terms of ascribing blame, if you like, but certainly one of the things that was strongly looked at as part of that inquest was the management of somebody who was known to have had some problems, and whether more should have been done, particularly within the department, about managing someone who had those issues. So I think if there's a lesson to be learned from those types of cases, it's certainly knowing and understanding there is that obligation, that you do have to have an understanding of where intervention is required and make sure you're taking those steps. Certainly, so far as intervention programs are concerned, the more we become aware of things that impact in a workplace, then obviously there will become that legal obligation to make sure that you follow through and follow that best practice to make sure that you aren't having those negative outcomes. Look, and there are other, quite apart from the Woods inquest, the other way we see it play out in terms of workplace behaviours, and this comes back to, I guess, another cultural issue, and that is in the bullying space. And I think some people, if not everybody in this room, may have heard of the Alec Meikle Crowley inquest currently going on. Findings haven't been handed down there. And that's an instance where a 16-year-old apprentice was allegedly subjected to some quite horrific workplace bullying practices. Now, an extraordinary facet of the evidence that came out of that, at least as reported in the press, was the suggestion from co-workers who were subjecting him to this bullying behaviour was that he should have come forward. That is, this 16-year-old apprentice should have come forward and told them, because if he'd told them that what they were doing was upsetting him, they would have stopped. Now, perhaps living in the real world, I think there seems to be, in that case, and as I say, I stress that findings haven't been made, but it seems as though the people aren't equipped with the tools for recognising where things are going on, where it might be affecting people, and understanding that they have to positively intervene and stop it before something happens. So
there's also got to be a workplace culture, doesn't there, that condones that kind of behaviour, that builds up over time, that says it's okay if we call it a bit of fun.
Yep.
To bully. They don't call it bullying. They sort of say harden up. We're just mucking around type of thing.
Yeah, and workplace initiations, that seems to be a bit of a trend in the construction industry. We saw back in 2004, there was another instance in New South Wales, a small company where an apprentice was subjected to an initiation ceremony where he was plastic wrapped to a trolley, then had wood shavings and wood glue stuffed in his mouth and fire hosed out, and amongst the people who were prosecuted over that were the two directors of the company as well as the company itself, in circumstances where one of the directors was in charge of the floor and knew this was going on and did nothing to stop it. And that was a successful work health and safety prosecution down in New South Wales, and justifiably so, I think. So you hear about those types of examples in the Meagle case. There are some cultural issues that the industry obviously needs to be aware of and address. I'd be surprised if anyone has a different conclusion to that.
John, is there more to be done with education of employers and what their responsibilities are to create that culture that doesn't allow this kind of behaviour?
Look, I think the bullying, the shift in the debates around bullying will help lift the profile of workplace behaviour in general. One of the stats for this conference, which we were all asked to research, I found that 56% had disclosed a mental illness to their employer in one of the studies that was done. Well, whoever did that study did not come to the building industry. Because if you think 56% of our employees would disclose a mental illness to their boss, you are in fairyland. And that then brings the question of why not? And the answer is the whole issue of, what will happen to me if I actually say I will be treated like a leper, I will be completely ostracised. So the challenge for the employer is if they create how do you create a positive culture? And the structures which we've talked about with subcontracting and economics, which I agree with David, we don't like psychological injuries because they take longer to heal. They're 8 weeks minimum work cover, our premiums go up. We'd like you to fix yourself. If we can cut a finger and get you back by the afternoon, we're much happier. So the question is, how do you create a culture where someone could genuinely report that they've had a mental illness? You've got to be kidding. We are a million miles from that. So that stat must have gone to some very white-collar girls somewhere that are all very happy playing social work, because there's no way in God's earth. Come on, mate, we're trying to wake up the joint, come on. Yeah, we're all dropping off there a bit.
When I said we needed some fireworks up here, I didn't think they'd be between you and I, John. But anyway, I won't buy into that. Might be a good time to go to the next question.
Can I?
John's a hit
sorry,
wherever
but
he
can I
goes.
just say that in the industry that I'm in, which has been
You want to show your emotions, being
no,
a girl?
I just don't have a white collar. Sorry. I think 56% is high from the industries I've been in. They're not bloke industries. I haven't been in bloke industry since I was a science teacher. But
I can't imagine too many women who care about career advancement going to their boss and saying, hey, I'm a little sad.
No. I worked in the Mental Health Commission in Western Australia. Someone told me they had a mental illness, but don't tell the person I'm reporting to because I might not keep my job. So if you're working in mental health, and in the doctors, actually they don't report either because they think that they will be discriminated against by their colleagues, and they just don't. I know a guy who goes to a private psychiatric hospital for his ECT because he doesn't want the people in the public system to know. So it's not just that. You might be tougher in the building industry, but I don't. No. It's everywhere.
Can I add? I need to expand a little bit because from what I have heard so far, everything we are talking about, maybe from bully behaviors, civilized behavior, and so on, actually it's really about cultural change. And that's exactly what I'm trying to say is, it is not just the program like connector training, assisted training. It's the cultural change through the process. And if we just borrow those programs, translate those programs to other industries, it won't work because they did not really capture the culture. They have to really build a program to fit into the culture. That is why mason construction is success, because it's really intertwined, weaved together. The mission is to change the culture. So it's not just the program per se. That's really what I'm trying to emphasize. Of course, we needed to have suicide prevention programs, but if we only emphasize the end product without changing the culture, we are not really doing enough. That's what I'm trying to say.
Now we have a question from Wayne Smith, the Executive Director of the National Fire Industry Association of Queensland.
Thank you. My question is an open question to all the panel. We hear a lot about penalties. We get a large profile in media and in the industry about the penalties that are applied to employers and employees who are not complying with health and safety responsibilities. And at times I think it's a reasonable comment to say that can be all fairly negative and it seems quite punitive. In the services trade sector that I come from, which represents commercial fire protection, commercial plumbing and commercial air conditioning, we work hard to acknowledge good performance through the Services Trades Queensland programs that we run, especially within our apprenticeships and in our post-trade training programs, where we aim to turn good performance into a competitive advantage for employees and employers out in the marketplace. Mates in Construction operates under a similar principle where it recognises those sites that are performing well with their programs. So my question is, what do you think as a panel can be done to make it more attractive for employers to engage in mental health and well-being? Should there be, for example, financial rewards and benefits for doing the right thing, such as, for example, a discount on their work cover insurance? Or there's probably other concepts that are worth exploring. That's my question.
Cameron,
thank you.
Thanks for the question, Wayne. Cameron, do you have a...
Yeah, I think the observation about penalties is a fair one. I mean, there are extraordinary work health and safety penalties now under the harmonised laws we've got in place. The law is a blunt tool in this space, frankly. You can incentivise people two ways, and I think you've identified this in your question. You can have carrots and sticks. Well, the law is a stick, and in this space, it's a bloody big stick. So the incentive for doing the right thing and the way the government approached these changes is one whereby there's a framework in place that says there's a responsibility and now a much more higher responsibility, for example, on officers. You know, people in charge of organisations have to drive the culture, have to drive the change. And if you don't, and something happens, there's a risk to somebody's health and safety, then you're at risk of a prosecution, and there's a penalty, or there's other alternative sentencing mechanisms that are available. I agree with you that that's not necessarily the best way to motivate and to effect change. And I think a more global approach would certainly be something justified and warranted in this space. And I say that against my own interests. So I think your idea of finding a way whereby good performers are rewarded in some way is certainly a great way of thinking about this sort of issue and a better motivator in my view. I don't think you can do away with the penalty regime altogether. I think it has to be that holistic approach. You can't have one without the other. But I'd certainly like to see a more positive reinforcement of and encouragement for good behaviour than currently exists.
Cameron, can I ask you to just remind everyone about Brodie's Law in Victoria? And
sure.
I'm specifically interested to know whether that has actually made any noticeable change, or is it too soon?
Well, I think Brodie's Law came out of, and for those who aren't familiar with the case, but Brodie's Law came out of a suicide down in Victoria. And Brodie was a waitress at a cafe. who was badly bullied by her co-workers to the point where she eventually took her own life. And that was a work health and safety prosecution down in Victoria. So quite apart from the work health and safety penalties that were imposed, I think somewhere around $110,000 on the employer, and the director some $30,000, and another 80-odd thousand split amongst the 3 workers responsible for those behaviours. Following that, the Victorian government passed Brodie's Law, and Brodie's Law is effectively a criminalisation of the worst end of the spectrum of workplace bullying, up to 10 years imprisonment from memory. So Victoria saw the need to criminalise, make a new criminal offence around that sort of high-end behaviour. Queensland hasn't followed suit. Look, I don't know that we need a further criminalisation. We already have, for example, stalking laws and things like that, which fit within that space under our existing criminal code. I don't know that introducing another penalty into this space is going to be a game changer. That's what Brodie's Law is about. Queensland hasn't seen fit to adopt it. I certainly wouldn't advocate for us to go down that road.
So, Leslie, in Queensland currently, if the same situation were to occur here, no one would be held criminally responsible, where if it happens again in Victoria, you are. Does that necessarily make a difference?
Well, I'm not big on creating new laws when you've got a law that's already adequate. I think often we do jump to, let's have a legislative solution. If we get just one more law, maybe we'll stop one more thing. I'm not big on that, and my role as a bureaucrat, I rarely recommend to governments they put more in legislation, because I just think we spend a lot of time in churn. So I think you do, as Jane said, use the laws you've got. The other point I was going to make, though, and it's something that I think we can contribute, some research has just come out of the UK, and we had people over here at Christmas time, not the best time to come to Australia. I told them everybody's on leave, but they came anyway. But it was looking at the cost of absenteeism and presenteeism, and I think there is an incentive for employers to have a mentally healthy workplace, because if it's a mentally healthy workplace, people are more productive. They're not just at work, slowly picking up the hammer or slowly typing on the keyboard. They are actually being more productive. And if you can actually quantify that, it does put intelligence into the mix, that you have an economic argument, because at the end of the day, people are in business to make a living and make a profit. You do have to, they hate being altruistic, and they have good hearts and minds and all that sort of thing, but they are in business. And if you can actually really persuade them that the statistics on a mentally healthy workplace directly relates to productivity, people are there, they count absenteeism, and often you don't get paid if you're absent, that's different. But if you're there and getting paid and not being productive, that's different. If you can get that, and we can get that right, then I think industry have an argument that they can take to their workers' comp and for their insurance, because if people are there, they're less likely to get sick, then that's a different argument. But I think it's an area where the UK are doing a lot of work, and we are going to watch that quite closely, because if we can give you that information and you can use that in your debates in persuading your employers, and then you can persuade your workers, your insurance companies, it is worthwhile. It's a worthwhile investment, apart from being a good thing to do. I think you need to use both arguments. I think it's a bit naive to just think employers will do things because it's good. If you can, yeah.
Dave, I know you're chomping at the bit to say something here, but I want to ask John first and draw back to the original question, which was, should there be financial rewards and benefits for doing the right thing? And the example was given, discount on work cover insurance or other ways to provide positive incentives to employers to do the right thing.
Emma, the definition of health that changed about 2 years ago to include psychological health is still working its way through the whole system. So most employers have ignored the change and haven't understood what it meant, and I think we're still grappling with what does it mean as an employer to now be responsible for perhaps the first time the psychological health of their workforce. That will drive an incentive as the psychological claims go up, and payments get made and premiums get fit, which is exactly the answer that Leslie just gave. In terms of directly giving incentives to employers to basically do what their duty is, I accept the premise, Wayne, that you might get a few people excited. I don't think it would work overall. I think employers have to come to grips with their original responsibility and do that. And if they did that a bit better, we wouldn't have to have the debates about encouraging people to do the right thing. Could I also just bear a second? I don't accept your premise for a second that Brodie's Law would operate differently in Queensland. It was a successful health and safety prosecution in Victoria. We would run the same case. It would be a successful prosecution here. That case was so extreme that the criminal justice system could operate equally in Queensland. It was one of the most horrific cases. To call that bullying is a greatest understatement. It was an outrageous abuse of power by people, and they deserved everything they got.
Dave Noonan.
First of all, on the question of Brodie's Law, it's come up, and I know Brodie's parents because they're very brave people who've been engaged in going around talking in lots of workplaces about what happened to their daughter and how to stop it happening again. And I've come to know them personally through that. I would recommend to people, if you get an opportunity to have Brodie's parents come and speak at one of your forums, you should do so. It's very tough and emotional, but I think people that show that degree of bravery and are prepared to contribute to educating people ought to be recognised, and their experience ought to be taken on board. John's right, that was an extreme example in the spectrum of bullying, and you know, if we're very frank about it, bullying's a bit like, people tell me dyslexia covers a whole range of different problems within education, reading and writing and so on, and it's labelled under one symptom. And bullying, unfortunately, I think is becoming a bit like that, because there are workplaces where people who don't want to work and don't want to be managed will allege bullying. I'm going to be quite honest about it, and that's a bit of a problem. But situations like Brodie's and some of the other ones we've seen of bastardisation of apprentices absolutely are worthy of a legislative response. And I don't care if it adds another law to prevent one individual like Brodie being treated in the way that she was treated. It is absolutely warranted that legislation went through. My organisation strongly supported it, and they ought to be treated as criminals because what they did was criminal to that young woman. In terms of the broader issue about incentives, I think, and I'm not experienced so much in the services trades because we don't cover them, and there's probably slightly better compliance, but I've got to tell you, in some of the finishing trades areas that we cover and some of the structural trades, you're flat out getting employers to pay any workers' compensation at all, and principal contractors very frequently don't care if they do or not. If they can get away with it, they'll take the extra cost. And that imposes a burden on workers, but also on the honest employers, the majority of employers who are honest and want to comply. So I don't mind, you know, if you want to say give incentives to stars, that's great, but let's get some of the bottom feeders, the scumbags out there complying so they don't free ride on the system. And that goes to the fact...
Who are you referring to there?
I'm referring to lots and lots of employers in the industry who deliberately undercalculate their workers' compensation premiums, who underpay, who don't pay workers' compensation premiums and other statutory entitlements, and the fact, including things like superannuation, whole range of things, and they use that to aggressively bid and undercut employers in the industry who actually do the right thing.
Are you saying that leads to, that perpetuates the culture, or what is it that you're...
It's really a response...
What's the line you're drawing here?
Oh, it's a response to the colleague's question from the services sector about rewarding. My point is let's actually get a level playing field and make sure there's actually compliance with the legal responsibilities before we start talking about rewarding the stars.
This is where I get moral outrage that employers couldn't possibly be underpaying anybody under their statutory. Just
John,
look at my moral outrage.
John, you know, and if you ask the majority of your members who are honest people who do pay their statutory entitlements, the majority of them, you ask them about the large minority that don't, and they'll be almost as outraged as I am because it costs them business and disadvantages them in the marketplace. So that's really the point I was seeking to make there, Emma. There are ways this can be dealt with, and it ought to be dealt with through procurement. At the moment, you know, the Commonwealth and state governments have got very, very detailed codes that lay down and guidelines that lay down all sorts of things about industrial relations behaviour that employers have to sign up to if they want to do state and federal government work. But they're bloody light on when it comes to occupational health and safety. They're light on when it comes to the compliance with workers' basic standards. And the level of insecurity and economic desperation that's created amongst the workforce by those sorts of fly-by-night operators, because you don't have much choice if you want to work in the industry. You're going to end up working for some scumbags. That's reality as a construction worker. The sort of is not a decisive factor. It is one of the factors that underlies job insecurity, stress, and feeds into the whole culture that we are talking about here.
Let's move on to the next question, which is from Jim Dandy, who is a self-employed construction worker, and I'm told he's travelled here at his own expense from WA.
Ladies and gents, first of all, I'd like to congratulate mates in construction. They've done a fantastic job. They're moving right throughout the country. I'm not mainly in construction, I'm in construction and mining. I'm a safety trainer, so I face a lot of people in the inductions who really don't want to be there. But what I was concerned about was that construction, mates in construction is mainly male dominated. There is a lot of pleasant ladies today, and we've kind of talked about that earlier. But what we're concerned about is one of the mates comes along to a connector and discusses a problem. Do you think there's an inclination of a bullying there, or we're looking here at possibly exposed to that because we're a male? We're actually saying something. The ladies, like you said, talk a lot more to each other and come out. So that's my one question. Do you feel that the males, when they do expose themselves, when they do kind of touch themselves, do they feel they're under a situation of bullying? The other one I would like to just egg on a little bit is maybe if we consider mates in construction and mining, because I realise that you build the mines, but then sometimes they jump ship to be an employee of the major, and we still need to look after them.
Dave, do you want to?
You're dead right about mining. My nephew was a victim of, well, he committed suicide. He was a mine worker in Kalgoorlie, and a lot of my family comes out of mining in Western Australia. I'm West Australian originally. And many of the same factors, I think, every suicide's very complex, and I think we know that. But many of the factors that were at work amongst my mates who've taken their lives in construction were definitely at work with Jeffrey, my nephew. I think there are some differences with mining and construction, but I think we have to get construction right. My own union, of course, is active in the mining industry. It's a different division. We operate differently, but I do know that they've got a great interest and they're watching closely what happens here. And I think that whether mates in construction may or may not be the right organisation, but I'd like to see it happening in the mining industry too, so that there are less people like my nephew, who, of course, whose death, helped wreck his family in a lot of ways. Coming back to your first question, I suppose you were saying, I gather you're saying blokes talking about their problems amongst themselves, does that expose them to ridicule and bullying? I think it might do sometimes. I think there are some cultural changes. I think the biggest problem is actually blokes not knowing how to deal with it when their mate tells them something. And I'll tell you another experience while I'm on a bit of personal experiences. In 1987, I was working on a major construction site in Melbourne. We used to get together, a lot of blokes from that job. It was a Jack Cheer job in South Melbourne, in South Yarra, for those of you that know Melbourne. We used to have a drink on Fridays, and one Friday it ended up I was one of the last two in the bar from the job with a mate of mine called Desi. He was a glazier. We had a big drink. We had too much to drink. He told me about his problems. He'd had a marriage bust up. I left him on the basis he was going to take his kids for the weekend. He was looking forward to having his kids. I came to work on Monday and Desi had had his kids on the weekend. He dropped them off at his ex-spouse's place, gone home and shot himself. And for a long time, including now, I always wonder what I missed. what I missed that could have changed that bloke's circumstances. Maybe something, maybe nothing. There's a lot of people in our industry that have had those sort of experiences. A few years ago I went to a meeting of the builders, labourers, shop stewards in this town, and I think Bob, you were there, I think a few of us were there, and it was an absolutely lacerating experience for me, because around that room, the story that I just told, and I told it that day, I think there were maybe a dozen people or more who got up and personally told their stories in a pretty much all-male group. Heads only their mothers would love, you know. A really rough group, you know, looking group of people, but people that were prepared to get up in a BLF delegates meeting and talk about their experiences on a very emotional and personal level. Now, I think that's a quantum leap, and that was Mates in Construction starting off. That is a quantum leap. I'm not going to say that's going to sort out every problem, but unless we have those very frank and emotional conversations amongst workers in the industry, then we're not going to get to first base. And I think that was a big step forward for a lot of us that day, and we need more conversations like that in the industry.
Emma, can I just make a personal observation? I think blokes have changed a lot since I was 20. They've had plenty of time to change since I was 20. But, you know, 5 years. Yeah, 5 years, absolutely. But they are far more likely, I think, to talk to one another and not be seen as a wuss. Whereas at one stage, you know, if you were in problem, you just got plastered, basically, and that's what you did and drove home. I think they have changed, and therefore I think they are better able to help themselves, and so we should just build on that wave. And you could be right, people could be opening themselves to bullying if they admitted they had a problem, but far less likely, I think, than when you and I were 25.
Can I just say that the Mates in Construction team, they understand the notion of confidentiality, they understand the notion of connecting people, they understand the notions of respect, and they understand the notion of credibility. And the Mates legend is only going to grow because of its credibility. And so people who have used the system have been treated with all those things, and that is the key. That's one of the keys to its success. So the idea of the way in which they operate and the way in which they observe those boundaries is critically important to the credibility of the scheme.
Which is why you don't grow it too fast.
Can I ask, because perhaps I hope I'm not the only one in this room who doesn't actually know the practicalities of Mates in Construction. How does it work? How does it become engaged in a site? Come on, Jorgen.
Come on.
Come on. Give him a microphone. That's it.
It's very simple. It's all volunteers. It's volunteer employers who invite us onto the sites to run the program. We do general awareness training with everybody on site, and we ask for volunteers to come forward to be connectors for their mates if they're doing it tough. We then provide some training to those connectors, 4 hours on the site, to what actually to look out for and what to do and how to start a difficult conversation. And we may then also have some suicide first aid workers in the workplace, so that when somebody actually had that conversation and doing it tough, we can provide some safety to them. And then we have case managers that support those people in actually getting access to the services they need. Because if we work 10-hour days, 6-day week, like going to the doctor is a major logistical exercise. It takes lots of planning. So it's about doing all those things to make it really easy. But what actually then happens is everybody works within the Mates in Construction program, not as employees of their employer. They're not connectors for their employer. They're not assist workers for their employer. They're connectors or assist workers as volunteers with the Mates in Construction program. So they take it on to the next site and the next site and the next site after that.
Thank you. Now, I think we have time for one final question, and it comes from Dean Miguel, the Chairman of the Protect Redundancy Fund Victoria and former State Secretary of the ETU, the Electrical Trade Union.
Emma, thanks for taking my questions. Probably directed to Cameron, and you've talked this morning around the panel about Brodie's Law, and without really going into it too much, I mean, she was a 19-year-old waitress that was subjected to extreme bullying, extreme stalking in a workplace, and she tragically took her own life. Yes, it was an extraordinary case, but the fundamental legal principles that sort of came out of that was the employer's duty to care, or failure to take reasonable care, as one of the key things that the courts identified. I'm wondering, maybe Cameron, if you can answer this, do you think in a legal sense it has precedent in terms of tackling issues that maybe Dave talked about and touched on, about workers working 4-hour shifts when 1 week off and not being able to access their families? Some of the excessive working hours that, while not relevant in construction in my state, we know are really extreme in others, extreme working hours. Do you think some of the principles of Brodie's Law will have greater implications?
Oh, I think you'd be drawing a long bow to suggest that the types of behaviours in Brodie's case would link back to a culture of excessive hours. I think Brodie's case was, and there were some particular personal circumstances involved around, as I understand it. She had a relationship, or a former relationship, with one of her co-workers that was subjecting her to the behaviour, and the types of behaviour that were, you know, putting ratsack in her purse and things like this, you know, and encouraging her to take her own life. I mean, that is such a culture of bullying so far beyond the pale that, look, you know, on one level I'm not surprised that the Victorian government took the step they did of passing a specific law. In terms of, though, I suppose the fundamental, and if there is that linkage between issues such as fatigue, quite apart from bullying behaviour, or whether it's other issues within the workplace that impact upon a person's state of mental health, that's, you know, within a workplace health and safety context, it fits within the same regime as being behaviour that is a hazard to a worker, and that where there's that legal responsibility for that hazard to be managed. And so it comes back to this issue of being able to identify these are the hazards from our type of work, and if the industry identifies that fatigue and working long hours has a linkage to people suffering mental health issues, and that may lead to adverse outcomes for their health, well, quite clearly under the regime we've got in Queensland as much as in Victoria, those issues under work health and safety laws need to be managed, need to be dealt with, and if you fail to do so, well, you know, the stick gets brought out. And I think, you know, the gap we've got, though, is that, or the gap we've had, is that there hasn't really been a mechanism for somebody to step in and intervene before it gets to, you know, that outcome stage. You know, there's an expectation that it needs to be managed, but is that actually being implemented in practice? And I think there needs to be some serious thought given about how you do that. And we've talked about workplace culture, and look, I'm not going to pretend for a second to be a workplace management consultant and tell people, well, if you do these things, you can change the culture in your workplace, in your industry, to make sure that we all know that these are issues that we need to deal with and move on with it. But, you know, I was actually thinking about this and thought, well, you know, what sort of things could you look at, or what things are out there that we've seen being adopted that might translate? And certainly from a bullying perspective, which was the Brodie's issue, if you want to look at a cultural change in an organisation, one that I quite liked, I'm not an AFL fan, but the Sydney Swans, you might remember years ago, adopted a policy of no dickheads. Now...
Gee, that's working.
Under Paul Roos, it worked very well. And in fact, I did see an article just recently where they were reinforcing the fact that the program is still going. So whether it's been necessarily wholly successful, I don't know. But what that was about was putting responsibility amongst the team for you know, identifying behaviours amongst each other that they were not going to accept, being able to become forthright with each other, brutally honest with each other, apparently, in terms of things that they were doing or ways they were behaving as a team that they weren't going to accept. Now, I think that's a concept that certainly the construction industry would, you know, have some strong resonance with. And if you're going to look at managing some of these issues, if you're looking at whether it's bullying, whether it's issues around fatigue or whatever else, well, maybe there needs to be that brutal discussion about behaviours or things that are happening that are causing people to have issues and being able to come forward with it. There's no one size fits all. There are no doubt millions of programs, and there are people around this table far more qualified than I am to talk about that. But that would be my view on that issue.
We've just got time for everyone to give a little closing comment. So, John, can I start with you?
Yeah, can I just say, I'll just build on what Cameron said. you know, we want companies to put out a bullying policy, and we want them to be on the front and say, we do not want behaviour that is threatening, that is intimidating, that is humiliating to others. And you want the CEOs to come out and make a broad statement about what is acceptable and unacceptable behaviour for their firms. You then want to put in a structure, which we talked about, so that how does an issue get raised, who do they talk to, who can actually understand the nature of the request, how will the request or complaint be managed, what does it mean for respecting both sides of the argument or both parties in the dispute, confidentiality requirements, and then the other issues about how proactive will an employer respond. You know, with early intervention, act promptly, take all claims seriously, at least in the first instance before you throw them out, procedural fairness to the parties, impartially in supporting all the parties, keeping good records, and then coming up with an outcome. There are proactive steps we can do, and we could take a model that would start from employers declaring, you know, that mental health is finally on their agenda. Thank you.
Peter?
Just one very simple statement, and work and life actually is intertwined. So when we're trying to address the mental health issue in the workplace, it's the same thing we're trying to address mental health issue at home in our life. So we have to take a holistic approach. It's not trying to just address people who actually attempt suicide. We actually needed to do this way ahead before things happening. Thank you.
Dave?
Well, I suppose just to reiterate a couple of fundamental views I've got, these things can't be dealt with in isolation. They've got to be dealt with as an industry. And if that cuts across the ideology that says every company and enterprise is an island, you know, which is an ideology some people have, so be it. We need to deal with this as an industry. So it needs an industry response, it needs employers, it needs unions, it needs workers in the industry, and it needs the clients, the end users, to be supportive of this.
A grand compact, as Paul Howes might say.
Well, you know, far be it from me to put words in Paul's mouth. We have to change some fundamentals in the industry, though, if we are going to address this in a more comprehensive way. Job insecurity is a fundamental that has to be looked at, attacked and addressed. And it's a big thing because it does create economic and political challenges in the current environment. But job insecurity, it's not the only cause, but it doesn't help, and it's a big contributor. Hours of work are a big contributor, and excessive overtime, and that culture is a big contributor. We talked about a no dickheads policy. Let me tell you, we are arguing every week with resource industry employers and their associations in Western Australia, and they will not move off the concept of a 4-on-1 roster. If we have a no dickheads policy, those dickheads need to change that policy. So I think that, you know, there's a lot of hope here because what you're seeing, I don't know of any other industry that has worked as hard to start to generate a response to these issues. And Mates in Construction, IncoLink, AusHelp, all of these organisations are really, really important about how we move forward going forward. We're not going to be able to abolish suicide in the construction industry, you know, but we can make a big difference. But the big difference needs to be made. The other thing I want to say is this. Organisations like Mates in Construction, conferences like this, need to be funded. And, you know, we see governments increasingly moving out of some of these social responsibilities. There are billions and billions of dollars floating around in the construction industry. Some of them are in the sort of funds, and I know some private employers have sponsored this here today, and that's good too, but a lot of the support historically has come out of redundancy funds, insurance funds, superannuation funds, precisely the organisations that are going to be dragged through the mud and attacked in the upcoming period of time. We need to understand and we need to explain more widely in society that those funds play an absolutely vital role in our industry in things like these Mates in Construction, but also in a whole lot of other ways, so that there is a balanced approach to these sorts of issues.
That's all.
Thank you. And can I give the final word to our Mental Health Commissioner?
Absolutely. I think the bullying stuff is messy because bullying, there's some really tragic bullying, and then there's people who think they've been bullied because somebody suggests they might come to work on time. And while we still have that mess, I think it does belittle the real bullying, and we have to get a bit clearer about that. There is a big difference, but really coming back, I think you're right, the solutions are different for every industry. There's a need for governments to help you find your solutions, but they depend whether you're in the mining industry, the construction industry. I was talking to someone who's talking about the concept of mates at gates. In the rural industry, it's different. The issue is the same, the solution is different, but as an industry you need to find it. And it does often stem from your workplace culture. It also stems from outside though, because you have responsibilities at work. You also all belong to a family or a community, and those responsibilities out there, and I think we can carry them both ways. It's very dangerous to do this, but I just had a brain flash because so many people have said they were from Western Australia. Western Australia had, and I think still has, a % for art in every big contract let for building government property. So you get the contract, and part of that, that's a % for art, so you get a lot of public art. Wouldn't it be interesting to see that if the government showed leadership with a % for mental health and wellbeing for a public contract? It's an interesting thought. Probably I shouldn't have said it in public, but I do these things. Thank you.
Can I thank all the panel members? I'm sure you'll all agree it's been a constructive and certainly thought-provoking session. I just thought, I've been making notes along the way, and I just wanted to recap on some of the issues that stood out for me. We kicked off with John telling us employers don't know how to deal with this issue, a very bold admission, and then Dave followed up by saying workers don't know how to deal with this either. That was, I think, very helpful, and I think what we get from it is that this is a critical discussion that needs to keep going. In construction, we know that you're 6 times more likely to die from suicide than a workplace accident, and I still keep coming back to that because it's just such a stunning statistic. Dave talked about working hours, and it was a constant theme. A lot of time away from family, especially in the Pilbara, the 4 weeks on and the 1 week off, and how damaging that can be to someone's psyche, not having that safe community around them, family and friends. Peter talked about not ascribing blame. Who's responsible? What are the causes? Laying blame isn't helpful, but we can talk about some of the contributing factors. Is it alcohol and substance abuse? Whatever it is, it's about identifying the risk factors. Travelling long distances for work and being away from family, again, was recurrent, and what effect that can have on people. Cameron Dean talked about a culture of hardness, about not wanting to show weakness in your industry. Again, that's something that continues to come up. Leslie Schubrick said, find out what works. That's her role. Find out what works and then help to spread that, helping people connect and nurturing good ideas. Men communicating differently to women, so it's good to see more women in this room and in the industry, people that perhaps men are more likely to approach in times of need. Mates in construction is more about suicide prevention, but it's also about creating communities and building a healthy environment where it's okay to talk about these difficult things. Most harsh is the fact that this industry is disconnected. John talked about it being a brutal industry in that sense, that you're constantly moving from job to job and not necessarily connected to a community that's an ongoing one. Leslie and John made the point that we don't talk about suicide, that it's something people would prefer to walk away from, that discussion. The talk went to Gavin Woods, the the issue of the deputy principal who suicided. We didn't talk a lot about the findings of the coroner's report, but there was a lot there about the manager making mountains out of molehills. And for someone who was already depressed and suffering anxiety, that in his mind compounded to an extent that made him feel particularly helpless. Initiation ceremonies, we touched on that, and some of the unsettling things that are still prevalent in the construction industry, but I hasten to add probably in many others too. John and others talked about the fact that, you know, you're away from work a minimum of 8 weeks when you have a mental health problem, and that's certainly not good economics for an employer or a company, so it's certainly a great motivator to attack the problem, the bottom line that is. Now, 56% of people reporting their mental health issue, we certainly debunked that theory. Unless, of course, you wear a skirt, you're unlikely to report. You're unlikely.
You could have forgiven me by now. These women, mate, they never forgive, mate.
And don't you forget it.
I thought Emma was talking about Scottish people then.
Tonight on Lateline. No. The law we heard is a blunt tool in this space, and it was refreshing to hear Cameron talk about the fact that creating more laws and inspiring more prosecutions isn't the way to go to tackle the problem. Mentally healthy workplaces aren't just pleasant places to operate in. Leslie reminded us they're also more productive and ultimately create better bottom lines for the employer. Dave told us that his family's from the mines in WA, and we had a very moving discussion with Jim Dandy raising the issue of bullying and ridicule that comes from actually exposing, or should I say revealing, your depression or anxieties. Jorgen then told us about the Mates in Construction and how that actually operates and available to all construction sites, trained counsellors who come and start that very difficult conversation so mates like Dave Noonan don't live with the burden of asking, could I have done more? Brodie's Law, we talked about the parallels, but that there probably aren't really many in the construction sector, but certainly lessons to be learnt about being aware of toxic environments, building in your workplace, and trying to stem that before it becomes a tragic and fatal circumstance. Constantly throughout this session we talked about changing culture and that everyone has a role in that. A no dickheads policy, ideally not initiated by a dickhead. Creating structures that promote early intervention. Peter reminded us that work and life are inextricably linked. It seems obvious, but it's something we all need to consider, I think. And Dave issued a call for the industry to work together and reminding that job insecurity is a contributor that needs addressing also. I'm about to wrap up, but I think I should mention that if you know someone who needs help, you can get in contact with Mates in Construction on their 24-hour helpline. If everyone has a pen and wants to write this down, I think it's probably a number everyone should have in their phones and should keep it handy. It's something that you can do that doesn't involve having to reveal your problems openly in any particular forum. It's just a phone call, and the number's 1300 642 111. 1300 642 111. Now, after the break, you're going to hear a keynote address from Dr. Sally Spencer-Thomas, who'll give us an international perspective. She's the CEO of the Carson J. Spencer Foundation. She'll talk a little more on suicide prevention. Thank you very much for having me here today, and you can see me tonight on Lateline.
Just on behalf of Aushelp and IncoLink and Mates in Construction, I just want to move a vote of thanks. I think as an industry that we can attract a panel like this says that we're probably onto something right collectively. Also, I want to thank All Trades specifically for for sponsoring the panel discussion.